Welcome to the Sleepy Scribe. Your endless internet wandering has brought you here, and hopefully you can finally sleep. Now before we begin, comment where you are listening and how late it is for you, and also subscribe, it is very appreciated. Let us begin. The rise of the Knights Templar began in the early 12th century, born from the chaos and bloodshed of the First Crusade. In 1119, 2 decades after Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, a French knight named Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. He and 8 fellow knights would dedicate themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. Baldwin granted them quarters in a wing of the royal palace, built atop the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, and so the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were formed. Their numbers were small, their resources few, but their mission was clear. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living as warrior monks bound by religious duty. What began as a modest order soon gained prestige. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Church formally endorsed the Templars. Their rule, inspired by that of the Cistercians, emphasized discipline, austerity, and unwavering loyalty. With papal backing, they were granted extraordinary privileges. They answered only to the Pope, paid no taxes, and were free from local laws. Donations poured in. Nobles offered land, money, and sons eager to serve. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had grown into a formidable force, with commanderies stretching from England to the Holy Land. Their white mantles marked with red crosses became symbols of both piety and fear. On the battlefield, they were relentless. Trained from youth, they charged in disciplined ranks, often holding the line when others broke. In the East, they helped defend Crusader states like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Anjou. At home, they built fortresses, managed estates, and oversaw one of the most sophisticated financial networks in medieval Europe. The Templars pioneered early banking techniques, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit money in one location and withdraw it in another. Their efficiency and integrity made them trusted custodians of wealth. Kings and popes alike used their services. Despite their success, tensions simmered. Some questioned the morality of warrior monks. Others envied their wealth and autonomy. In Islamic lands, they were both feared and hated. Yet in these early years, the Templars stood at the height of their power, a rare fusion of sword and faith, forging an identity that would shape the legends and conspiracies surrounding them for centuries. The reign of Charlemagne marked a pivotal transformation in the medieval West. Crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in the year 800, Charlemagne's coronation symbolized the revival of imperial power in Western Europe centuries after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. His dominion stretched across what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern Italy, and parts of Central Europe. But his rule was not defined merely by conquest. Charlemagne pursued a vision of unity built on Christian faith, centralized authority, and learning. His court at Aachen became a hub for what historians later called the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of intellectual revival that aimed to standardize Christian practice and preserve classical knowledge. Latin texts were recopied, monasteries became centers of learning, and literacy among clergy improved. However, Charlemagne's empire remained a fragile patchwork, held together by loyalty oaths, appointed counts, and the emperor's personal authority. Communication across such a vast realm was slow and uncertain. The missi dominici, royal envoys, traveled constantly to supervise local administration and enforce royal will. Justice, often delivered in open-air assemblies, blended old Germanic customs with Roman legal traditions and Christian morality. Despite these efforts, the empire was not immune to internal fractures. Upon Charlemagne's death in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited an empire already strained by regional identities and noble ambitions. Louis attempted to maintain unity, but his reign was marred by rebellions and a growing tendency among Frankish rulers to divide land among heirs. This culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, when Charlemagne's grandsons split the empire into 3 parts: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia. This division laid the foundation for modern France and Germany. Meanwhile, external threats grew. Viking raids along the northern coasts, Saracen incursions from the south, and Magyar invasions in the east all exposed the weaknesses of the fragmented Carolingian order. Local lords, better positioned to defend their regions than distant kings, built fortifications and amassed private armies. This shift marked the gradual rise of feudalism, a decentralized political structure where loyalty and service were exchanged for protection and land. Castles, once rare, became central features of the medieval landscape. As the Carolingian legacy faded, the power vacuum it left behind shaped the next phase of medieval Europe, one dominated not by emperors but by dukes, counts, bishops, and knights, all vying for control in a world where law, land, and loyalty were inseparable. As the Carolingian Empire fractured and localized power grew, the feudal system matured into the dominant structure of medieval European society. At its core was the relationship between lord and vassal, bound by mutual obligation. A nobleman, often a powerful landholder, would grant a fief, a piece of land, to a vassal in exchange for military service and loyalty. This system created a complex web of allegiances that extended from kings to the lowest knights. Peasants, or serfs, worked the land, bound to it by birth and custom, owing labor and a portion of their harvest in return for protection. While serfdom was not slavery, it offered little freedom. The manor became the center of daily life, a self-sustaining unit where agriculture dictated rhythms, and the seasons governed existence. The manor house, church, fields, and mills formed the physical heart of medieval rural society. Life was hard, but predictable. Beyond the countryside, the church continued to shape every aspect of medieval life. It provided not only spiritual guidance but also education, record-keeping, and legal authority. Monasteries flourished, preserving ancient texts, producing manuscripts, and offering refuge to the sick and poor. Monastic orders such as the Benedictines set rules for communal living, emphasizing prayer, labor, and study. Meanwhile, the papacy increasingly asserted its authority, claiming supremacy over all Christendom. The power struggle between popes and kings became a recurring theme. Nowhere was this clearer than in the investiture controversy of the 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII clashed with Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who held the right to appoint bishops. The Pope excommunicated the emperor, who in turn made a public penance at Canossa in 1077, a humbling moment that symbolized the growing power of the Church. At the same time, new threats and opportunities emerged. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, urging Christian knights to retake Jerusalem from Muslim control. The response was overwhelming. Nobles, knights, and commoners alike took the cross, driven by faith, ambition, and the promise of eternal reward. The Crusades marked a dramatic shift in medieval Europe's gaze, outward toward the Holy Land and the Islamic world. While the First Crusade achieved its goal with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, it also ignited centuries of religious warfare and cultural exchange. European knights encountered advanced Islamic science, medicine, and architecture, bringing home ideas that would slowly transform the West. But the cost was enormous. The Crusades drained resources, intensified religious hatred, and deepened the rift between Latin and Eastern Christianity. In parallel, towns began to rise in importance. Trade revived along old Roman routes and new markets flourished. Merchant guilds, skilled artisans, and chartered cities laid the foundation for a burgeoning middle class. The balance of power began to shift. Wealth no longer flowed only from land but also from commerce, especially in places like Venice, Genoa, and Bruges. The medieval world was evolving, not just through war or piety, but through trade, learning, and the assertion of new voices within the old feudal order. The growth of medieval towns created new social dynamics that challenged traditional feudal structures. These burgeoning urban centers attracted peasants seeking freedom from manorial obligations and serfs hoping for a chance at a different life. Towns offered charters, legal documents granting rights and privileges, often negotiated with local lords or kings. These charters allowed towns to govern themselves, levy taxes, and establish markets. As towns grew, so did the influence of the merchant class. Guilds organized craftspeople and traders, regulating quality, prices, and training through apprenticeships. Guild members enjoyed protection and a voice in civic affairs, marking the rise of a new social order between nobility and peasantry. The universities that began to appear in cities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford reflected this new intellectual spirit. Rooted in cathedral schools, universities taught the liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine. Scholars debated the works of Aristotle, rediscovered through Arabic translations, sparking the scholastic movement which sought to reconcile faith and reason. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas argued that reason and divine revelation were compatible, shaping medieval Christian philosophy for centuries. Meanwhile, the architecture of the era symbolized both spiritual devotion and civic pride. The Gothic style emerged in the 12th century, characterized by pointed arches, flying buttresses, and vast stained-glass windows. Cathedrals like Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, and Salisbury Cathedral rose toward the heavens, inspiring awe and devotion. These monumental buildings required the cooperation of skilled masons, artisans, and patrons, reflecting the interconnectedness of medieval society. Politically, the period saw the gradual consolidation of royal authority, particularly in England and France. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 brought new administrative reforms, including the Domesday Book, a detailed survey of landholdings and resources that allowed more effective taxation. English kings like Henry II expanded royal courts and legal systems, laying foundations for common law. In France, the Capetian dynasty steadily increased its control over fragmented territories through diplomacy, marriage, and warfare. At the same time, the Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and principalities, with emperors often struggling to assert dominance over powerful nobles and the papacy. Warfare remained constant, shaped by the demands of feudal loyalties and territorial ambitions. Knights, heavily armored and trained from youth, became symbols of martial prowess and chivalric ideals. Tournaments offered a stage for display and competition, blending sport and military training. Codes of chivalry emphasized honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak, though in practice the reality was often brutal and pragmatic. Castles dotted the landscape, serving as fortresses, noble residences, and administrative centers. These stone structures were engineered for defense with thick walls, towers, moats, and murder holes. They embodied the militarized nature of medieval society and the constant threat of conflict, whether from rival lords, foreign invaders, or peasant uprisings. The Black Death, which would arrive in the 14th century, loomed beyond this period, ready to transform medieval Europe in unimaginable ways. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, the medieval world was a tapestry of war, faith, learning, and growth, complex and often contradictory, setting the stage for the changes that would lead to the early modern era. The relationship between the medieval church and state was a defining feature of the era, shaping politics, culture, and society. The church held immense power, both spiritual and temporal, influencing kings and commoners alike. Popes claimed authority over all Christians, asserting supremacy even over monarchs, leading to frequent conflicts. One of the most famous clashes was the investiture controversy, a struggle over who held the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the King. This dispute between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV in the late 11th century culminated in Henry's dramatic penance at Canossa, symbolizing the tension between religious and secular powers. Beyond politics, the Church was a unifying force in medieval life. The calendar revolved around religious festivals, and the sacraments marked key moments from birth to death. Monasteries served as centers of learning, preserving classical texts and producing manuscripts by hand. Monks and nuns provided education, medical care, and hospitality to travelers. The rise of new religious orders like the Cistercians and Franciscans reflected evolving spiritual needs. The Franciscans, founded by Saint Francis of Assisi, embraced poverty and simplicity, preaching to the poor and emphasizing personal devotion. The Crusades were a direct consequence of the Church's desire to reclaim the Holy Land and unite Christendom. Starting in 1096, a series of military campaigns called by popes drew knights, peasants, and nobles from across Europe. The First Crusade succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, establishing Crusader states. However, subsequent crusades were marked by failure, internal conflicts, and shifting priorities. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to sack Constantinople in 1204 deepened the divide between the Western and Eastern Christian worlds. The Crusades also had lasting impacts on trade, culture, and knowledge. Contact with the Byzantine Empire and Muslim lands introduced Europeans to new goods like spices, textiles, and scientific ideas. Cities such as Venice and Genoa flourished as trading hubs. The transmission of knowledge included advancements in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, sparking the beginnings of the Renaissance. In everyday life, the medieval peasantry formed the backbone of society. Most people lived in rural villages under the authority of local lords, working the land in exchange for protection and a portion of their crops. Life was harsh and labor-intensive, with seasons dictating the rhythm of work. Peasants were bound by customs and obligations, but they also enjoyed community traditions, festivals, and religious observances. Over time, some peasants gained freedoms or rights, leading to gradual social changes. Medieval art and literature reflected the values and experiences of the time. Illuminated manuscripts, richly decorated with gold and vibrant colors, preserved religious texts and chronicles. Epic poems like the Song of Roland and romances celebrated heroic deeds and courtly love, blending history and myth. Troubadours and minstrels entertained with music and stories, preserving oral traditions. Gothic cathedrals themselves were expressions of faith and community, with sculptures and stained glass telling biblical stories to largely illiterate populations. Medicine in the medieval period was a blend of ancient knowledge, superstition, and religious belief. Physicians relied on texts from Hippocrates and Galen but also consulted astrological charts. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God or the result of imbalanced humors. Treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer. Hospitals run by religious orders offered care, though understanding of disease was limited. Despite hardships and conflicts, the medieval period was a time of vibrant cultural and intellectual activity. It laid foundations for modern Europe through its institutions, art, philosophy, and evolving social structures. The interplay between faith, power, and daily life created a complex world where tradition and change coexisted, setting the stage for future transformations. Feudalism was the dominant social and economic system of medieval Europe, structuring society around relationships derived from the holding of land in exchange for service and labor. At its core was the lord-vassal relationship, where a noble granted land, known as a fief, to a vassal, who in return pledged loyalty, military service, and counsel. This network of mutual obligations created a hierarchy that extended from kings at the top to peasants and serfs at the bottom. Kings granted large territories to powerful nobles who ruled over them almost like miniature monarchs, administering justice, collecting taxes, and raising armies. Knights, often vassals themselves, served their lords as heavily armored cavalry, embodying the martial ideal of the age. Their code of chivalry emphasized bravery, loyalty, and honor, though in practice the realities of warfare and politics were often more pragmatic and brutal. Below the knights were peasants and serfs who worked the land. Serfs were bound to the manor and owed labor and dues to their lord, though they were not slaves and had some rights under customary law. Their lives were centered on farming, and they endured hard work, poor living conditions, and the constant threat of famine and disease. The manorial system, a key component of feudalism, was the economic backbone of medieval life. The manor was a self-sufficient estate including the lord's residence, peasant villages, farmland, forests, and pastures. Peasants grew crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and vegetables, raised livestock, and produced goods like wool. The manor provided most necessities for daily life, limiting the need for trade in many regions. Despite its rigidity, feudalism was not uniform across Europe. Variations existed based on local customs, geography, and the strength of royal authority. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066 centralized power under William the Conqueror, who introduced a more structured feudal hierarchy documented in the Domesday Book. In France and Germany, competing nobles often challenged royal power, leading to fragmented and fluid political landscapes. Over the centuries, feudalism evolved. The growth of towns and trade in the High Middle Ages began to challenge the manor's self-sufficiency. Wealth from commerce gave rise to a new class of merchants and artisans, the bourgeoisie, who lived in walled towns and operated under charters granting limited freedoms from feudal obligations. This economic shift began to undermine the traditional social order. The Hundred Years' War between England and France further accelerated changes. The development of professional armies and the use of gunpowder weapons diminished the military role of knights and the feudal levi. Monarchs consolidated power, weakening noble independence. At the same time, peasant revolts and social unrest indicated growing tensions within the system. Feudalism's legacy is complex. It shaped medieval Europe's political structures and social relations for centuries, embedding a system of hierarchy and obligation that influenced law, landholding, and governance. While often seen as a rigid and oppressive system, it also provided order and stability in a fragmented world. Its decline paved the way for the rise of centralized nation-states and the modern era's social and economic transformations. The medieval church was a dominant force in European life during the Middle Ages, influencing spiritual, political, and cultural realms. The Catholic Church was not just a religious institution but a powerful political entity with vast landholdings, wealth, and influence that extended across kingdoms. The Pope, based in Rome, was regarded as the supreme spiritual leader of Christendom, claiming authority over kings and emperors alike. This claim often led to conflicts between secular rulers and the Church, exemplified by disputes such as the investiture controversy, where emperors and popes clashed over who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots. The Church's hierarchy mirrored feudal structures, with the Pope at the top, followed by cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, and monks. Monasticism played a crucial role, with monasteries serving as centers of learning, agriculture, and charity. Orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and later the Franciscans and Dominicans shaped religious life and education. The Church was also the guardian of knowledge during this period. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving classical texts and religious writings, which would later fuel the Renaissance. Cathedral schools evolved into universities, laying the foundation for higher education in Europe. The Church influenced daily life through the sacraments, festivals, and moral teachings, shaping people's worldview. The calendar was marked by holy days and saints' feast days, and pilgrimages to shrines like Santiago de Compostela were common spiritual practices. Art and architecture flourished under church patronage, leading to the construction of grand cathedrals in the Gothic style, with soaring spires, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows that conveyed biblical stories to an illiterate populace. The Church also played a role in warfare and diplomacy. The Crusades, a series of religiously motivated military campaigns, sought to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control and were sanctioned by the papacy. These campaigns had profound effects on European and Middle Eastern societies, promoting trade, cultural exchange, and military innovation, but also causing immense suffering and lasting animosity. Despite its power, the Church faced criticism and calls for reform. Corruption, simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and the moral failings of clergy led to movements like the Waldensians and later laid groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. The medieval church's influence permeated all aspects of life, from the birth to the death of individuals, controlling rites such as baptism, marriage, and burial. Its reach extended beyond Europe, as missionaries spread Christianity into Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, integrating diverse peoples into the Christian world. Through its spiritual authority, economic power, and cultural leadership, the medieval church shaped the trajectory of European history during the Middle Ages and beyond. The feudal system was the social and economic structure that defined medieval Europe, shaping relationships between kings, nobles, knights, and peasants. At its core was the exchange of land for loyalty and service. Kings granted large parcels of land called fiefs to powerful nobles, who in turn promised military support and counsel. These nobles, often called lords, subdivided their estates to lesser nobles or knights, who pledged to fight for their lords and maintain order on their lands. At the bottom of the hierarchy were peasants and serfs, who worked the land to produce food and goods, sustaining the entire system. Serfs were bound to the land and owed labor, rent, and various fees to their lords but were protected by the lord's authority. Life for peasants was hard and precarious, dominated by agricultural labor and subject to the demands of their overlords. The manorial system was the economic complement to feudalism, organizing rural life around self-sufficient estates called manors. Manors included the lord's residence, peasant villages, farmland, forests, and mills. The medieval church was one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages, deeply influencing every aspect of life from kings to peasants. The Pope, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, held spiritual authority believed to be granted directly by God. The Church's reach extended across Europe, transcending borders and kingdoms, uniting diverse peoples under a common faith. Cathedrals and monasteries were not only places of worship but also centers of learning, art, and charity. Monks and nuns dedicated their lives to prayer, study, and copying manuscripts, preserving classical knowledge through turbulent times. The Church's hierarchy was complex, with bishops overseeing dioceses and priests tending local parishes. It controlled vast lands and wealth, often rivaling secular rulers in power. The Church also shaped medieval culture, influencing laws, morals, and education. Pilgrimages to holy sites and the veneration of saints were important religious practices that reinforced community bonds. The Crusades, launched to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, were major military and religious campaigns that highlighted the Church's role in mobilizing knights and kings for a common cause. The Church's power, however, was not without challenges. Conflicts between popes and monarchs over authority, such as the investiture controversy, exposed tensions between spiritual and temporal power. Heresies and dissent occasionally arose, leading to inquisitions and persecution. The Church's monopoly on knowledge also meant that it controlled the interpretation of scripture and doctrine, shaping the worldview of medieval people. Despite criticism and reform efforts, the medieval Church remained a dominant force, guiding the spiritual and social lives of millions and leaving a lasting legacy on European history. The feudal system was the dominant social and economic structure in medieval Europe, shaping life from the 9th to the 15th centuries. At its core, feudalism was based on the exchange of land for military service and loyalty. Kings granted large estates, or fiefs, to powerful nobles called lords. These lords, in turn, parceled out portions of their land to vassals, knights who pledged military service and allegiance. At the bottom were peasants or serfs who worked the land, providing food and labor in exchange for protection. Serfs were bound to the land and could not leave without the lord's permission, living harsh lives marked by toil and limited freedoms. The manor was the basic unit of feudal society, a self-sufficient estate where lords exercised economic and judicial control. Manorial courts settled disputes and enforced local laws. Feudal obligations created a complex web of loyalties and duties that structured medieval politics and warfare. Knights trained from childhood in the art of combat and chivalry, sworn to defend their lord and uphold a code of honor. Castles dotted the landscape, serving as fortified residences and symbols of noble power. Feudalism also influenced culture and art, with troubadours and minstrels spreading tales of courtly love and heroic deeds. While feudalism provided order and stability after the chaos of the early Middle Ages, it also entrenched social inequalities and limited mobility. Over time, economic growth, the rise of towns, and centralized monarchies challenged feudal bonds, leading to gradual transformation. Yet the legacy of feudalism remained deeply embedded in European history, shaping its social fabric for centuries. The Crusades were a series of religious wars sanctioned by the Latin Church in the medieval period, primarily between the 11th and 13th centuries. Their main goal was to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy sites in the Near East that had fallen under Muslim control. The First Crusade was launched in 1095 by Pope Urban II, who called on Christians to take up arms in response to appeals from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, whose empire was threatened by the Seljuk Turks. Thousands of knights, peasants, and nobles responded, driven by religious fervor, the promise of salvation, and the lure of wealth and land. The journey to the Holy Land was perilous, marked by battles, starvation, and disease. In 1099, Crusaders captured Jerusalem after a brutal siege, establishing several Crusader states. The success inspired further campaigns, including the Second and Third Crusades, which involved notable figures like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the Muslim leader who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. The Crusades had profound effects beyond the battlefield. They facilitated cultural exchanges, increased trade between Europe and the East, and spurred technological and intellectual advancements. However, they also led to widespread violence, persecution of Jewish communities, and strained relations between Christian and Muslim worlds. The later Crusades were less successful, and the movement eventually faded, but the legacy of the Crusades shaped medieval geopolitics, religious identity, and cross-cultural interactions for centuries. During the later Middle Ages, the Black Death emerged as one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, profoundly shaping medieval society and Europe's future. Beginning in the early 1340s, this bubonic plague spread rapidly across the continent, killing an estimated 25 to 30 million people, roughly one-third of Europe's population at the time. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through fleas carried by black rats that traveled with merchants and armies along trade routes. The plague arrived in Europe via ports such as Messina and quickly overwhelmed towns and cities. Symptoms began with fever, chills, and swollen, painful lymph nodes called buboes. Death often came within days, sometimes as quickly as 48 hours after infection. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were largely ineffective or harmful. The Black Death caused widespread social, economic, and religious upheaval. Labor shortages led to demands for higher wages and contributed to the decline of the feudal system as serfs and peasants gained leverage against lords. Many towns faced severe disruptions as entire households died. Fear and misunderstanding fueled persecution, with Jewish communities often scapegoated and violently attacked. The Church, unable to explain or stop the plague, saw its influence challenged, leading some to question long-held religious beliefs. However, the pandemic also led to advances in public health measures and changes in attitudes towards medicine and hygiene. Artistic and literary works from the period reflected the pervasive presence of death and suffering, influencing cultural expressions for generations. The Black Death's impact on demographics, economics, and social structures set the stage for the Renaissance and transformed medieval Europe into the early modern world. The Hundred Years' War was a prolonged conflict between England and France that lasted from 1337 to 1453. This nearly 116-year struggle fundamentally reshaped medieval Europe's political landscape and military tactics. The war began primarily over claims to the French throne, with Edward III of England asserting his right through his mother, a French princess. The French crown, however, passed to Philip VI, leading to a fierce dynastic rivalry. This conflict was not continuous warfare but consisted of several phases punctuated by periods of truce and uneasy peace. The early stages featured English dominance on the battlefield, with victories such as the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the English used longbowmen effectively against French knights. The war devastated many French regions, leading to widespread famine and destruction. The arrival of Joan of Arc in 1429 marked a turning point. She inspired French forces to lift the siege of Orleans and helped Charles VII reclaim his throne. Her involvement symbolized a rise in French national identity and morale. Over time, the conflict evolved from a dynastic dispute into a broader struggle over territorial control and sovereignty. The war introduced new military technologies and tactics, including the increased use of gunpowder and artillery, which gradually rendered traditional knightly cavalry less dominant. By the war's end, England had lost most of its continental possessions, retaining only Calais until 1558. The Hundred Years' War also affected society beyond the battlefield, influencing taxation, governance, and national consciousness. It exposed weaknesses in feudal structures and contributed to the decline of chivalric ideals. Economically, the war strained both kingdoms but led to increased centralization of authority. The legacy of the war remains significant, as it set the stage for the emergence of modern nation-states in Europe and shaped the cultural memory of both England and France. The mid-15th century saw the decline of feudalism and the rise of stronger centralized monarchies in Europe, a transformation accelerated by the lingering effects of the Hundred Years' War. As England and France emerged from the conflict, both kingdoms underwent significant political and social changes. In England, the war's end contributed to internal strife, most notably the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. This conflict arose partly due to the weakened authority of the monarchy after years of expensive overseas campaigns and shifting loyalties among the nobility. The wars devastated the English nobility and altered the monarchy's structure, ultimately culminating in the rise of the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII's victory in 1485. In France, the aftermath of the Hundred Years' War fostered a resurgence of royal authority. Charles VII implemented reforms that improved tax collection and administration, consolidating power in the hands of the king. The war had also sparked a stronger sense of French national identity, fueled by figures like Joan of Arc and the collective struggle against foreign invasion. Beyond these political shifts, Europe in the 15th century witnessed economic growth and cultural revival, setting the stage for the Renaissance. Trade expanded, especially in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, where wealth from commerce funded artistic and intellectual achievements. Advances in technology, such as the printing press invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge. This period also saw the rise of humanism, an intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical texts and the potential of human reason. The late medieval period was a time of transition marked by both continuity and change. Feudal ties slowly loosened, towns and cities grew, and monarchs centralized authority, setting the foundation for the modern states that would dominate Europe in the coming centuries. These developments intertwined with the legacies of war, religion, and cultural exchange to create a complex historical tapestry. By the late 15th century, the age of exploration was beginning to reshape Europe's view of the world and its place in it. Driven by a combination of economic ambition, religious zeal, and technological innovation, European powers sought new trade routes and territories beyond the traditional boundaries of Christendom. Portugal and Spain led the charge, funded by monarchs eager to expand their influence and wealth. Portuguese navigators like Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored voyages along the African coast, gradually mapping its contours and establishing trading posts. This era witnessed the gradual improvement of navigational tools, including the magnetic compass and the astrolabe, enabling sailors to venture further into the open ocean with increasing confidence. Meanwhile, Spain, united under Ferdinand and Isabella, sought to compete with Portugal's successes. Their sponsorship of Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage led to the unexpected encounter with the Americas, an event that would alter global history. The medieval mindset, heavily influenced by religious doctrines and limited geographical knowledge, struggled to comprehend the vastness and diversity of the new lands and peoples encountered. The encounters brought about profound consequences, including the spread of European diseases to indigenous populations, the beginning of transatlantic slave trade, and the establishment of colonial empires. These developments marked the end of the medieval world in many respects, as the expansion into the Atlantic and beyond opened new economic and cultural frontiers. Back in Europe, the Renaissance flourished, fueled by the rediscovery of classical antiquity and the influx of wealth from overseas ventures. Art, science, and philosophy advanced rapidly, challenging old ideas and promoting new ways of thinking. The printing press facilitated the spread of these ideas, contributing to growing literacy and the eventual questioning of religious and political authority. Simultaneously, the Catholic Church faced internal challenges that would culminate in the Reformation of the 16th century, signaling further transformation. Thus, the late medieval period blended the fading traditions of the feudal and religious order with the emerging forces of global exploration, intellectual inquiry, and state building, setting the stage for the early modern era. The Hundred Years' War, spanning from 1337 to 1453, was a prolonged and complex conflict between the kingdoms of England and France, rooted in disputes over territorial claims and the French crown's succession. It was not a continuous war but a series of conflicts, truces, and political maneuverings that reflected the shifting alliances and power struggles of medieval Europe. The war began when Edward III of England asserted his claim to the French throne after the death of Charles IV, the last direct Capetian king, challenging Philip VI's succession and sparking a dynastic rivalry. The English possessed strong military advantages early on, notably the longbow, which proved devastating in battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English forces defeated larger French armies through tactical innovation and disciplined archery. However, the war also coincided with the catastrophic outbreak of the Black Death, which decimated populations and altered the social and economic structures of both kingdoms. This plague disrupted armies, reduced manpower, and contributed to periods of truce. The war deeply impacted medieval society, accelerating the decline of feudalism as monarchs increasingly relied on professional armies and taxation. It also fostered a sense of national identity in both England and France. French resurgence came under leaders like Joan of Arc, whose inspirational role during the Siege of Orleans in 1429 reinvigorated French morale and contributed to turning the tide in favor of Charles VII. Joan, claiming divine guidance, symbolized the merging of religious fervor and nationalist sentiment. The eventual French victory in 1453, with the English expelled from most continental territories except Calais, marked the end of medieval military dominance by chivalric knights and heralded new forms of warfare, including the increasing use of gunpowder and artillery. The war's conclusion also set the stage for the rise of centralized monarchies and the modern nation-state. Throughout this turbulent period, the war's effects rippled across Europe, influencing art, literature, and politics. It exemplified the complexities of medieval power struggles, where personal dynastic claims, economic interests, and evolving military technology intertwined to reshape the medieval world. The Hundred Years' War continued to define the mid-15th century as both England and France endured immense strain from decades of conflict. After the inspirational rise of Joan of Arc and the subsequent lifting of the Siege of Orleans in 1429, French forces began reclaiming lost territories with renewed vigor. Joan's capture in 1430 and execution by the English, however, turned her into a martyr, further galvanizing French resistance. Meanwhile, English fortunes waned due to internal political conflicts and the loss of key territories. The French adopted new strategies, increasingly relying on artillery and fortified positions that gradually undermined the English advantage in open battle. The economic cost of the war was immense, draining royal coffers and destabilizing feudal systems, forcing both kingdoms to innovate in governance and military organization. The conflict saw the rise of professional soldiers and a gradual shift away from feudal levies. By the 1440s, the English found themselves confined to a few enclaves, with the French launching decisive campaigns to expel them. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the war's final major engagement, where French artillery decimated English forces, effectively ending English ambitions in France. This defeat coincided with the broader decline of English influence on the continent, signaling a turning point in European geopolitics. The war's end allowed France to emerge as a more unified and centralized state under Charles VII, while England turned inward, facing its own dynastic struggles known as the Wars of the Roses. Beyond the battlefield, the Hundred Years' War reshaped medieval society by accelerating changes in warfare, governance, and national consciousness. It underscored the waning power of the medieval knight and heralded the rise of infantry and gunpowder weapons, which would dominate future conflicts. The war's legacy is reflected in the emergence of modern European states and a transformed political landscape that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and early modern period. The political landscape of 15th-century Europe was in constant flux, with the decline of feudalism giving rise to powerful centralized monarchies. France, still healing from the devastation of the Hundred Years' War, began rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, focusing on strengthening royal authority over rebellious nobles. The monarchy sought to reduce the power of feudal lords by establishing a standing army loyal to the crown, which marked a significant shift from the traditional reliance on noble levies. This period also witnessed the growth of towns and commerce, spurred by increased stability and the gradual recovery from war's destruction. The emergence of guilds and trade networks fostered economic resilience, while monarchs imposed taxes and laws to regulate markets, contributing to state formation. England, meanwhile, was embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that further weakened the nobility and devastated the countryside. The struggle for the throne disrupted trade and daily life, leading to social unrest and shifts in allegiance that foreshadowed the eventual Tudor dynasty. The rise of the printing press in the mid-15th century, pioneered by Johannes Gutenberg, revolutionized communication and the dissemination of knowledge. Books, once rare and expensive, became more accessible, promoting literacy and new ideas that challenged traditional authority. This technological innovation played a crucial role in spreading Renaissance humanism and later, Reformation thought. Religion remained a dominant force shaping medieval life, with the Catholic Church exerting significant influence over politics, culture, and education. However, dissatisfaction with clerical corruption and the lavish lifestyles of some church officials sowed seeds of reform. Movements like the Lollards in England and the Hussites in Bohemia criticized church practices and advocated for a return to scriptural primacy, foreshadowing the upheavals of the 16th century. Meanwhile, the rise of the Ottoman Empire posed a new threat to Christian Europe. The capture of Constantinople in 1453 by Sultan Mehmed II marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and shifted the balance of power. The Ottomans expanded into southeastern Europe, prompting responses from European states that ranged from diplomatic alliances to military campaigns, including the formation of crusading orders. Culturally, the late medieval period was rich and complex. The flourishing of Gothic architecture gave way to early Renaissance styles, blending religious tradition with renewed interest in classical antiquity. Universities expanded, preserving and advancing knowledge in theology, philosophy, and the sciences. Meanwhile, chivalric ideals continued to shape the nobility's self-image, even as warfare and politics demanded pragmatic adaptation. This era laid the groundwork for the transition from medieval to early modern Europe, a world on the cusp of profound transformation. As the 15th century advanced, the social fabric of Europe underwent profound changes that altered the daily lives of peasants, artisans, and nobles alike. The Black Death, which had ravaged the continent a century earlier, had drastically reduced the population, leading to a labor shortage that shifted economic power toward the working classes. Serfs and peasants found increased bargaining power for better wages and living conditions, weakening the rigid feudal system that had defined medieval society. This demographic shift encouraged migration to towns and cities, fueling urban growth and the rise of a more diverse middle class. Trade flourished along the burgeoning routes connecting Europe to Asia and Africa, with Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa dominating Mediterranean commerce. These cities became hubs of wealth and culture, attracting artists, merchants, and thinkers who contributed to the Renaissance's intellectual awakening. Technological advancements such as improved shipbuilding and navigation instruments enabled explorers to venture farther than ever before. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator's patronage, pioneered maritime exploration along the African coast, laying the foundation for the Age of Discovery. These voyages not only expanded European horizons but also initiated complex interactions with distant peoples, setting the stage for global empires and cultural exchanges. In the realm of warfare, the introduction of gunpowder weapons transformed military tactics and castle design. Fortifications evolved from towering stone walls to angled bastions designed to withstand cannon fire. Armies became more professional, incorporating infantry armed with firearms alongside traditional cavalry. These changes diminished the military dominance of the knightly class and empowered monarchs who could afford to equip and maintain standing forces. Politically, the consolidation of kingdoms continued with marriage alliances and dynastic claims reshaping borders. The unification of Spain through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 was a pivotal moment, leading to the completion of the Reconquista and the eventual sponsorship of Columbus's voyages. This union set a precedent for centralized authority and imperial ambition that would influence European history for centuries. Religious life remained central but increasingly contested. The Renaissance papacy, while lavish and politically engaged, faced criticism for corruption and nepotism. Calls for reform grew louder, laying the groundwork for figures like Martin Luther in the next century. Mysticism and new religious orders emerged, emphasizing personal piety and devotion, signaling a shift in spiritual expression. Education and the arts blossomed, supported by wealthy patrons eager to display their status and power. The late medieval period witnessed dramatic transformations in European society, culture, and politics that would shape the future in profound ways. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, which had spanned much of the 14th and 15th centuries, finally drew to a close in 1453 with the French reclaiming most of their territories, thanks in part to new military technologies like the longbow and early cannon. This conflict, though devastating, stimulated the rise of national identities, fostering a sense of unity and pride among common people and nobility alike. The war also strained feudal armies and accelerated the decline of the knightly class, replaced increasingly by professional soldiers and mercenaries. In England, internal strife culminated in the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle that would end with the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Across the continent, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 revolutionized the dissemination of information. Books became more accessible, literacy slowly increased, and ideas spread rapidly, challenging traditional authorities in religion and governance. This technological leap helped fuel the Renaissance and later the Reformation by empowering individuals to engage directly with texts. Economically, the late medieval period saw the continued growth of towns and the merchant class, which began to exert influence in political affairs. Guilds regulated trades and protected members' interests, while banking families like the Medicis of Florence accumulated enormous wealth and patronized the arts. The rise of capitalism's early forms intertwined with expanding trade networks reaching into Asia and the Americas. Socially, the Black Death's aftermath still echoed, but populations gradually recovered. This growth intensified competition for land and resources, leading to tensions and periodic peasant revolts, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. These uprisings challenged the established social order and hinted at the coming shifts toward more centralized state power. The church remained a dominant institution, but cracks were appearing. Calls for reform echoed across Europe as corruption and political entanglements eroded papal prestige. Monastic orders reformed, and lay movements sought personal spirituality outside clerical mediation. These religious currents sowed the seeds for the seismic changes of the 16th century. Meanwhile, art, architecture, and philosophy flourished as the ideals of humanism took root. The renewed interest in classical antiquity inspired monumental works and new intellectual pursuits that blended faith with reason and creativity. Universities expanded their curricula, training a new generation of thinkers who would question and transform medieval worldviews. In summary, the 15th century was a pivotal era marked by conflict, innovation, and cultural rebirth. It saw the gradual dismantling of medieval structures and the emergence of modern nation-states, laying the groundwork for exploration, colonization, and religious reform. The legacy of this time continues to influence the trajectory of Western civilization to this day. The late medieval period's political landscape continued to shift as powerful monarchies solidified their control, edging toward the early modern era. In France, King Louis VI's reign was marked by efforts to centralize authority and reduce the influence of rebellious nobles, laying the groundwork for a more unified kingdom. His diplomatic cunning and strategic marriages extended French territories and diminished feudal fragmentation. England, under Henry VII, emerged from civil war and established the Tudor dynasty, focusing on restoring royal authority and stabilizing the economy after decades of turmoil. The Iberian Peninsula witnessed the decisive completion of the Reconquista in 1492, as the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. This victory not only united Spain under Christian rule but also allowed the monarchy to direct attention and resources toward overseas exploration. That same year, Christopher Columbus's voyage, sponsored by Ferdinand and Isabella, opened the gates to the Americas, fundamentally altering global history. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork of semi-autonomous states, though emperors sought to exert influence over its vast territories, often contending with powerful princes and city-states. The political complexity of the empire reflected the enduring legacy of feudalism amidst emerging centralized powers. Economically, trade flourished as new routes to the east were sought and the discovery of the New World promised unprecedented wealth. Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa thrived as commercial hubs, their fleets dominating Mediterranean commerce. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas would later cause inflation but also stimulate economic growth in Europe. Social structures began to shift further as a burgeoning middle class gained prominence, challenging traditional aristocratic privileges. The cultural flourishing of the Renaissance continued, with artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo pushing the boundaries of art, science, and engineering. Their works exemplified the era's fusion of scientific inquiry and artistic expression. Education expanded with humanist scholars promoting classical learning and critical thinking. Religious life, however, remained tense. The Catholic Church, although powerful, faced mounting criticism for corruption and excess. Calls for reform intensified, culminating in the early 16th century with figures like Martin Luther challenging church doctrines, an upheaval that would fracture Christendom. In sum, the late 15th century was a time of profound transition. Monarchs consolidated power, exploration redefined horizons, and cultural achievements reshaped thought. The medieval world was giving way to new realities, setting the stage for the transformative centuries ahead. The dawn of the 16th century saw the final years of the medieval era blend into the dawn of modernity, as European powers continued to evolve politically, economically, and culturally. The consolidation of nation-states became a dominant trend, with monarchs strengthening their control through more efficient administrations, professional armies, and centralized taxation systems. France under Francis I exemplified this shift, fostering a strong monarchy that patronized Renaissance arts and pursued territorial expansion. England, following the Wars of the Roses, solidified the Tudor dynasty's rule, balancing diplomacy with military power to maintain stability. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire struggled with internal divisions but remained a central player in European politics. Religious tensions simmered as the Catholic Church confronted growing calls for reform, which would soon erupt into the Protestant Reformation, altering Europe's spiritual and political landscape. The Reformation challenged the Church's authority, leading to conflicts that would dominate much of the century. Overseas, the spirit of exploration sparked by Columbus's voyages led to increased expeditions, colonization, and the beginning of global trade networks. Spain and Portugal spearheaded these efforts, establishing vast empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The influx of precious metals and new commodities reshaped European economies and societies, fueling both wealth and conflict. Cultural achievements continued to flourish as Renaissance humanism spread northward, influencing education, science, and the arts. Innovations in printing allowed ideas to disseminate rapidly, shaping public opinion and intellectual discourse. Meanwhile, technological advancements in warfare and navigation transformed military and exploratory capabilities. Socially, the rigid feudal hierarchies of the medieval period gradually gave way to more complex class structures, with emerging bourgeoisie gaining influence in cities and courts. Despite these changes, many medieval institutions and traditions persisted, creating a complex tapestry of continuity and change. The early 16th century was thus a pivotal moment, where medieval legacies met new forces of change, setting Europe on a path toward profound transformation that would define the modern age. As the 16th century progressed, the tension between tradition and innovation intensified, creating a dynamic and often volatile European landscape. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, spread rapidly across the continent, fracturing the religious unity that had defined medieval Christendom. This schism ignited wars, political alliances, and social upheavals as rulers and populations chose sides between Catholicism and emerging Protestant sects such as Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglicanism. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, a concerted effort to reform internal corruption, reaffirm doctrine, and reclaim lost territories. The Council of Trent, convened between 1545 and 1563, played a crucial role in revitalizing Catholicism, emphasizing education, discipline, and missionary work. This period saw the rise of new religious orders like the Jesuits, who became instrumental in spreading Catholicism worldwide. Politically, Europe was marked by fierce rivalries and shifting alliances, with major powers such as Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire vying for dominance. The Habsburg dynasty, ruling both Spain and the Empire, sought to maintain Catholic hegemony through strategic marriages, warfare, and diplomacy. Meanwhile, England's break with Rome under Henry VIII led to the establishment of the Church of England, further complicating the religious and political map. These religious conflicts were often intertwined with struggles for power, territory, and influence, affecting everyday lives and shaping national identities. The era also witnessed significant cultural and intellectual developments. The Renaissance, fueled by humanist ideals, encouraged critical inquiry, artistic expression, and scientific exploration. Figures like Copernicus challenged long-held geocentric views, while artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael created works that blended religious themes with human emotion and classical beauty. The invention and spread of the printing press facilitated the rapid dissemination of ideas, enabling both reformers and counter-reformers to reach wider audiences. Overseas, European powers expanded their global reach through exploration, colonization, and trade. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires brought vast wealth but also devastating consequences for indigenous populations. The Atlantic slave trade began to take shape, underpinning the emerging global economy. Despite the turmoil, this period laid foundational changes that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment and the modern nation-state system. The latter part of the 16th century was marked by intensified conflicts and profound transformations throughout Europe. The religious wars that had simmered since the Reformation erupted into open battles, particularly in France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Netherlands. The French Wars of Religion, spanning from 1562 to 1598, were a brutal struggle between Catholics and Huguenots, the French Protestants. These conflicts devastated the French countryside and saw atrocities such as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across the country. Eventually, the Edict of Nantes in 1598 granted limited religious freedoms to the Huguenots, attempting to restore peace but leaving tensions unresolved. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire became the epicenter of religious and political strife. The empire was a patchwork of semi-autonomous states and principalities, many of which had adopted Protestantism. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had allowed rulers to choose their state's religion, but it failed to resolve deeper conflicts. These tensions contributed to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618, a devastating conflict that would engulf much of Europe in the early 17th century. In the Netherlands, the struggle for independence from Spanish rule began in the 1560s and culminated in the 80 Years' War. Protestant Dutch provinces resisted the Catholic Spanish crown's attempts to enforce religious conformity and political control. The conflict gave rise to the Dutch Republic, a significant maritime and economic power. The rise of powerful monarchies also shaped this era. Queen Elizabeth I of England, ruling from 1558 to 1603, skillfully navigated religious divisions, fostering a Protestant England while maintaining relative internal stability. Her reign saw the flourishing of English literature and exploration, with figures like Shakespeare and Sir Francis Drake rising to prominence. At the same time, Spain reached the height of its imperial power under King Philip II. The Spanish Armada's attempted invasion of England in 1588 ended in defeat, marking a turning point in naval dominance. Culturally, the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods brought dramatic new art and architecture styles that reflected both religious fervor and monarchic grandeur. In sum, the late 16th century was a time of violent upheaval but also remarkable cultural and political developments that shaped the trajectory of European history. The close of the 16th century saw the continuation of significant religious, political, and social shifts that would define the early modern era. The tensions from the Reformation persisted, fueling conflicts and leading to increased state centralization across Europe. In France, the fragile peace granted by the Edict of Nantes was frequently challenged, and the religious divide continued to shape French politics and society. The Huguenots maintained strongholds and influence but faced ongoing persecution and pressure to convert. In England, the transition from Elizabeth I to James I in 1603 marked a shift in monarchy, with James uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. His reign introduced new challenges in managing religious factions, particularly tensions with Catholics and Puritans, which would later erupt into civil war. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire's internal divisions deepened, and the stage was set for the protracted and devastating 30 Years' War that began in 1618. This conflict would involve much of Europe and have profound demographic and economic consequences, reshaping political boundaries and alliances. The Dutch Republic continued to consolidate its independence, establishing itself as a major commercial and naval power with a thriving culture of art, science, and commerce. Globally, European exploration and colonization accelerated, with Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands expanding their overseas empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. These ventures brought wealth but also new conflicts and the beginning of a global system of trade and empire. Culturally, the late Renaissance transitioned into the Baroque, influencing art, music, and literature with dramatic, emotional styles that reflected the era's turbulence and grandeur. The closing decades of the 16th century thus set the foundation for a century marked by war, exploration, and cultural flourishing, all emerging from the complex legacies of the medieval and Renaissance worlds. The early 17th century in Europe was dominated by the build-up and eruption of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that arose from a volatile mix of religious, political, and territorial disputes within the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which had attempted to ease tensions by allowing rulers to choose the religion of their territories, failed to provide lasting stability. Protestant and Catholic factions clashed repeatedly, and the rise of militant Calvinism further complicated the religious landscape. The immediate catalyst was the defenestration of Prague in 1618, where Protestant nobles threw Catholic officials out of a castle window, igniting open rebellion against Habsburg authority. This act triggered a series of wars that engulfed much of Central Europe, drawing in external powers such as Sweden, France, and Spain, each pursuing their own agendas. The conflict devastated populations through battles, sieges, famine, and disease, with some regions losing up to a third of their inhabitants. It also reshaped the political map of Europe, weakening the Holy Roman Emperor's authority and elevating the power of territorial princes and emerging nation-states. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 finally ended the war, establishing principles of state sovereignty and non-interference that became the foundation of the modern international system. Beyond the battlefield, the war accelerated changes in military tactics and technology, including the professionalization of armies and the increasing importance of artillery and fortifications. The social impact was profound, with widespread displacement, economic hardship, and shifts in population distribution. Culturally, the war inspired artistic and literary reflections on suffering and faith, while also spurring intellectual debates that would contribute to the Enlightenment. The 30 Years' War thus marked both an end and a beginning, a tragic climax to religious conflict in Europe and a transformative step toward the modern state system. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War left much of Central Europe in ruins, with cities reduced to rubble and vast swaths of farmland devastated by years of continuous fighting. The social fabric had been torn apart, entire communities were displaced, and many survivors faced famine, disease, and economic collapse. The war also altered the balance of power, significantly weakening the once dominant Habsburg dynasty. The emperor's control over the Holy Roman Empire was diminished as territorial princes gained greater autonomy, marking a shift from a fragmented empire toward more centralized nation-states. France emerged as a dominant European power, capitalizing on the decline of Habsburg Spain and Austria. The Swedish military interventions introduced new methods of warfare and demonstrated the importance of well-trained, professional armies over mercenary forces. These changes influenced military strategies for decades to come. Politically, the Peace of Westphalia established key principles, including the recognition of state sovereignty and the right of rulers to determine their own religious policies without outside interference. This agreement laid the groundwork for modern diplomacy and the concept of the nation-state. Economically, the war's devastation prompted shifts in trade routes and agricultural practices, accelerating recovery efforts that varied widely across regions. Culturally, the trauma of the war influenced art, literature, and philosophy, with themes of suffering, faith, and human endurance becoming prominent. The conflict's religious dimension also faded over time, replaced by more secular and pragmatic approaches to governance and international relations. In many ways, the 30 Years' War acted as a crucible for modern Europe, reshaping its political landscape, social structures, and cultural identity. It underscored the dangers of religious fanaticism and political fragmentation while highlighting the necessity for diplomacy and balance of power. This legacy continued to influence European history, politics, and conflicts well into the modern era. As the 17th century progressed, the social and economic landscape of Europe continued to evolve in the wake of the 30 Years' War. The war had left an indelible mark on the population, especially in the German states, where depopulation due to battle, famine, and disease was severe. Recovery was slow, and the rebuilding of towns and infrastructure was a daunting task. The war's end also coincided with the gradual rise of absolutism, a form of governance where monarchs centralized power and sought to reduce the influence of nobility and representative bodies. In France, King Louis XIV became the embodiment of absolute monarchy, famously declaring "État, c'est moi, I am the state." His reign saw the consolidation of royal power, expansion of the French state, and a culture that glorified the monarchy. Louis' policies were influenced by the desire to avoid the religious and territorial conflicts that had plagued Europe. Elsewhere, the Dutch Republic experienced a golden age, marked by flourishing trade, science, and art. The mercantile class gained influence, and cities like Amsterdam became hubs of international commerce. The rise of capitalism and early modern financial institutions began to change the structure of European economies. The shifting balance of power also led to new alliances and conflicts. The rivalry between France and the Habsburgs continued to shape continental politics. In Eastern Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth struggled with internal divisions and external threats from the expanding Russian Empire and the Ottoman Turks. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was at its territorial peak but would soon face challenges from European powers seeking to curtail its influence. Religion, while less often the cause of outright war, remained a potent force in society and politics. The Catholic Counter-Reformation revitalized the Church and influenced art, education, and culture. Protestantism diversified into numerous denominations, shaping identities and alliances. Scientific discoveries during this period began to challenge traditional worldviews, setting the stage for the Enlightenment. Figures such as Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler advanced knowledge of astronomy and physics, undermining old cosmologies rooted in religious doctrine. The changes in thought, governance, and society during the late 17th century formed a bridge between the medieval and modern worlds. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War was thus not just about destruction and loss but about transformation, politically, socially, and intellectually. This period laid foundational elements for the nation-states, secular governance, and scientific inquiry that would define Europe's future. The dawn of the 18th century ushered in an era marked by the continued rise of powerful centralized states and the shifting dynamics of European politics. Monarchs like Peter the Great of Russia embarked on ambitious projects to modernize their realms by adopting Western technologies and administrative reforms. Peter's extensive travels through Europe inspired him to build a new capital, St. Petersburg, a symbol of Russia's new European orientation and naval ambitions. Elsewhere, The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, embroiled much of Europe, a conflict triggered by the death of the childless Charles II of Spain. European powers feared the unification of the French and Spanish crowns under the Bourbon dynasty would upset the balance of power. The resulting conflict involved complex alliances and battles across the continent and the Americas, ultimately leading to the Treaty of Utrecht, which redistributed territories and checked French expansion. This period also saw the Enlightenment begin to take shape, with thinkers like Voltaire, Locke, and Montesquieu questioning traditional authority, advocating for reason, and laying the groundwork for modern political and social ideas. Scientific advances continued with Isaac Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation, which provided a new framework for understanding the natural world. The interplay between emerging secular philosophies and entrenched religious institutions created tensions but also fostered debate and innovation. Economically, the growth of colonial empires and the transatlantic trade brought wealth and resources to European powers but also intensified exploitation and conflict, particularly involving indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. The early 18th century was thus a time of both consolidation and contest, where old medieval structures gave way to new political orders, and where the seeds of modernity were sown amid ongoing struggles for power, faith, and knowledge. The early 18th century also witnessed significant developments in art and culture, reflecting broader shifts in society and politics. The Baroque style, characterized by dramatic expression, grandeur, and movement, dominated European architecture, music, and painting. Composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel produced works that remain cornerstones of classical music, blending religious themes with intricate musical structures that mirrored the era's complexity. Meanwhile, literature and philosophy flourished as salons and coffeehouses became centers of intellectual exchange. The rise of the novel as a literary form reflected changing tastes and the growing importance of individual experience and emotional depth. In parallel, the scientific revolution's impact extended into practical applications such as improved navigation and military technology, which fueled the expansionist policies of European powers. The age of exploration, initially driven by curiosity and trade, increasingly took on political and imperial significance as nations vied for control of strategic ports and territories around the globe. These global interactions facilitated cultural exchanges but also led to violent confrontations and the displacement of indigenous populations. Within societies, social hierarchies remained rigid, but the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and individual rights gradually eroded unquestioned obedience to monarchy and church. Economic theories such as mercantilism dominated, promoting state control over trade and colonies, yet early capitalist practices began to emerge, setting the stage for future economic transformations. Education expanded, though largely limited to elites, sowing the seeds for more widespread literacy and intellectual engagement in subsequent centuries. The early 1700s thus represent a bridge between medieval legacies and the modern world, a period of transformation where art, science, politics, and philosophy intertwine to reshape human understanding and societal structures. Good night. Hope you enjoyed The Sleepy Scribe. Until we meet again.